Welcome to the Run Radio podcast. My name's Trina, and in the writer's room, Viven Sieber. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you
How
for
are
having
you?
me.
Yes,
I'm
thanks
good.
for being here. So, you've been writing for a little while. Tell me a little bit about your experience and everything you've been doing.
Well, it's of course it's a sort of experience that's gone on throughout my life because it's a family history. But about when my father died in 2000, I inherited this box of amazing photographs, a attaché case of letters between him and my grandmother and some other people. They were just completely jumbled up. Fortunately, my dad typed his letters.
Oh,
His writing was awful. And my grandmother wrote in English, which was really helpful. But before he died, he'd done a survey of the girls that my grandmother had cared for when she was matron of a hostel for girls saved on the Kindertransport. They were refugees from Vienna. My grandmother ran a cinema, and the family bought it in 1915. And then they escaped in 1938, and grandmother began working in this hostel. And she'd always talked about the girls she cared for. She talked about them, that she read their letters and postcards. And what my dad did was he did a survey of them, asking what had happened to them. So they were now old ladies, and they wrote incredibly movingly about leaving their families as young children, adjusting to hostel life, and what happened to them, how they had careers, they became mothers and grandmothers. And the final thing that sort of put the whole thing together was a trip to Vienna where we actually visited my grandmother's flat. And it was by chance. I knew the address and I just emailed all the people in the building. And we had one invitation for tea or coffee and homemade strudel. And it turned out it was grandmother's flat. And the people living in it had already been to the archive. And so they told us where to go and what to do. And I put all that together, and that became the book.
goodness, that's a lot of stuff to keep track of. I sometimes have trouble making sure I get my 3 gratitude notes written down, but to be so detailed and thoughtful about future people coming back and looking at stuff, what do you think motivated him to do that? Do you think he was just doing it for his own potential reference, or do you think he planned?
No, he wanted to thank the people who had set up the committee, who ran the
Oh.
hostel, because it was all completely done by charity.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a few families because the first hostel was in Newcastle, was in Tynemouth. And he wanted to thank those families, not least because he'd actually lived with one of them. He moved in about 1939, and he never really moved out again. He was with them throughout the war. And I mean, I knew them obviously when I was a child, and I still see their grandchildren.
At what point did you decide to start aggregating everything and collecting it for the purpose of a book?
It was a bit random. At first, I was just trying to work out what happened. And then, of course, we had a lockdown as well. So I had plenty of time. And writing was relatively easy. It's a way of sorting out what you think. And so I did some time-lapse. I actually trained as a geneticist. So the first thing I did was draw a family tree. Because actually I had no idea about my grandmother's family or my grandfather's family, even less. And so just working out who was who when they were born, and then sadly working out where they died as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of them didn't survive the Holocaust. Most of them were murdered in assaulted concentration camps.
Was all the information a surprise to you?
Some of it was, yes.
Okay.
One of the things was that, there are things you get told as a child and sort of family stories. And my father always said, oh, I was 16 when I came to England. Actually, he wasn't. He was just over 17. It was like 6 weeks after his birthday.
Yeah.
I mean, that you've got, paper evidence of when he came.
Yeah.
Oh, and he left some manuscripts as well that hadn't been published.
Really?
Yes, so that I folded them into the book. So they sort of tell his story.
Uh-huh.
And they sort of describe his war, which was very interesting because he was 17 when he came to England. He got a place at Newcastle University for refugees. They had 10 places for refugees. And he had to get English matric in 10 months, which, bearing in mind, he came from Austria and he'd not really been a very diligent student.
Mm-hmm.
Must have been very hard. But then he just starts his degree and then he's interned. He's essentially arrested and stuck on the Isle of Man and then sent to Canada.
Mm.
And while he was in Canada, he kept his journal while he was interned. So we've got a like day-to-day record of what he was doing, which was fascinating. And then he comes back, finishes his degree, and then was the first enemy alien to serve in the Navy.
Mm.
They moved him to naval intelligence, and he wrote about that in some of his books.
At what point were you confident in your writing skills in order to put all of that together, or was that not trouble for you at all?
I come from a university background, so although I'm a biologist, I moved from writing, well, you write very differently.
Yes.
To writing strategy papers for universities. So I'm quite used to writing. I wasn't used to writing A, history, and B, something long and readable.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a wonderful editor who helped, Mark Cripps. So he looked at my manuscripts and said, no, you can't have 122 footnotes. And no, chapters should not be 50 pages long.
Oh.
So he chopped it all up for me beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And incorporated the footnotes.
Do you think this sounds like a huge project and a personal project? Do you think that you will continue to write, and what kind of writing will you do if so?
Well, at the moment, I'm being invited to talk about the book and talk about the story because people are very interested in the Kinder and the Kindertransport story and the hostels,
Mm-hmm.
and actually my grandmother's cinema. So I'm doing talks. I'm not quite sure what I want to write next. There obviously is another family story like that. What's
one of your favorite stories?
You mean from the book or in life? Oh, I suppose because I've been lucky enough to meet some of the Kinder, there are stories where they talk about that. Elfie in particular talked about living in the hostel in Windermere and being how wonderful the teachers were to them, because the teachers were faced with 25 girls who didn't really speak English, came from a different education system. By the time they moved to Windermere, the school was already full because they'd already moved a lot of children out of cities because of bombing. And yet they took them in, and teachers gave Elfie sort of extra classes after school to help her get school certificates. So I think it's the stories the girls told.
What else really caught your attention when you were going through all of the notes? And were you worried? It sounds like your father was very thoughtful and dated a lot of things, but were you worried about the timelines at all? Did you have to go through those a lot?
Yes.
I was gonna say.
My sister started it. She started a timeline. I think she started it in Word, and we just kept on adding it to it as more and more papers came up. So it started with great grandparents born in Brno, such and such a date, and then there was an aunt that I discovered quite late on that I hadn't realised I'd got that aunt. Great aunt. So I just kept adding to this Word document. It's quite big now.
I'd say.
Using I'm very fond of purple, so I used purple to sort of show some of the new bits.
Okay.
I mean, if you're going to ask me if I would do it that way, if I started again knowing what I know, I think the answer is probably no.
Yeah.
I'd probably be much more careful about how I collected my resources.
Careful in what
How I
aspect?
collated them. And because I've worked a lot with librarians,
Oh,
I
okay.
learned a lot from them. So I was very good at the reference managing and things like that.
Yeah.
And I tended to put everything into the reference manager.
Have you ever thought about helping other people organize their stuff and notes?
I'd love to.
From
I mean,
your
yes, I've
experience?
done that with students.
You have, yeah.
Yes, no, it's quite a fun thing to do.
Oh, it seems like such a daunting task. What kind of tips would you give to anyone that is wanting to start archiving and noting stuff that they have found from their family?
Be very organized.
Yes.
And find a system that works. So with all the letters that I'd got, there was, I mean, you just imagine a great big small suitcase of letters, random,
Yeah.
not all the pages are together, so you have no idea what's going on. And I just put them in transparent sleeves, and where I worked out the date, and I wrote little notes on the outside, and I used colored dots to show me who was worth talking to who and things like that, which meant I didn't have to keep going back to that every letter.
Mm-hmm.
And that was quite a crude way of doing it.
Yeah.
And the family tree was really useful. And
Was
if
it was it difficult to track down people that you wanted to talk to?
well, no, because the people I wanted to talk to were the Kinder, the old ladies from the hostel. And my dad had very thoughtfully left me a list of their contact details.
Oh.
Now, of course, very sadly, very few of them are left.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one amazingly, the address I had was the Isle of Wight.
Mm-hmm.
And when she finally rang me up, she'd moved from the Isle of Wight 12 years earlier. She's in Wimbledon, London now.
Mm-hmm.
But either the person who bought the house or the neighbours just sent it on. That was very lucky. I mean, of course, some never replied.
Hmm. Have you ever thought about trying to go back and follow up to see if anyone would respond now, or maybe someone else intervened and got, the message that didn't before, or are you kind of done with that chapter?
What's happening is that the children, I mean the grandchildren,
Yeah.
we're sort of making contact with one another. Yes, so very, very lovely. I've had lunch with two of the Kinder's granddaughters.
Nice.
And we go and we go and see Inga, who was the youngest of the children. She was only 5.5 when she came out. She's 90 next week. We had lunch with her last week. She's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the BBC picked up part of the story. So there are the BBC Newcastle podcast called The Girls, which is the history of the lost hostel. And they found an amazing number of people.
Oh, wow.
Both locally in Newcastle and all over the place.
Was there any one lesson or something profound that came out of all of this for you personally?
Well, yes. I mean, what it started as like a detective story, like let's work out what happened. And it sort of but the people became real during, as you find out more about them. So to some extent, the tragedy of those that were killed becomes even greater. It's no longer, I mean, yes, it's very shocking when you can get everything off databases now. So when someone's, my great aunt Zelma, who had the cinema ran it with my grandmother, she died in Theresienstadt, and just one night that, you know, her death certificate popped up on my screen. Now that's quite shocking. But of
Hmm.
course, I always knew I had a great Aunt Selma, but I didn't know anything much about her.
Mhm.
You know, I now know that she was much, you know, quieter and less flamboyant than my grandmother. You know, and that makes the tragedy more real, if that makes sense.
You mentioned a sister. Did you have any other siblings, living siblings that helped in this
I've only
process?
got one
You've
sister,
got one sister.
but my
Was
husband was wonderful. He was
yes,
totally patient and put the computer back together, and, you know, carried bags and checked the manuscript and did lots of everything, really.
wonderful. Sounds like you had a great support system. What else would you like to share about your process in writing the book or your research?
Well, the other thing I did was I emailed, there's a local museum in Vienna for the district where the cinema is, Josefstadtstraße. And I emailed them. They were closed when we were there. And I got a very quick reply from the conservators of the Jewish database, Helen and Heinz Rupertsberger. And they were completely wonderful. And at one point, I emailed and said, how can I find out what happened to the cinema after the war? And I was hoping they'd say, well, you go to this archive, or, you know, this is what you do. But 2 weeks later, I got an email with a timeline in English. And Helen had photographed 120 documents and put them in Dropbox for me. So they'd like been to the archive, worked it all out, and they've answered all sorts of stupid questions. And it was an enormous privilege to meet them last year. And they've just been so kind and helpful. I have to say, the City and State Archive in Vienna have also been wonderful. They sent huge packages of papers,
Oh, wow.
free.
Mhm.
So that's been really good.
Very good. Tell people where they can go to connect with you and buy your book.
You can it's called Kino and Kinder, and you can get it on Amazon or at your local bookseller. And looks like that. It's got 80 odd original photographs from the big box that I found in the corner.
Oh, goodness.
And it's my name, Sieber, spelled Sieber.
All right. And did you self-publish this or did you work with someone?
No, I worked with a publisher. I worked with Eye2Eye Publishing, who've been really supportive and helpful, and provided the editor, Mark Cripps, who was endlessly patient.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing your book and your story with us, and come back anytime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.